He pulled a knife on a little girl right outside Buckingham Palace. The royal guard watching didn't shout, didn't call for backup, didn't make a scene. He just raised his rifle, and that was enough. What happened next will make you see these ceremonial soldiers completely differently. But before we get into it, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's dive in. The late morning sun was doing that thing it does in London, through the clouds in patches, making everything look like an old photograph one minute and blazing bright the next. The air carried that mix of exhaust fumes and anticipation you only get in tourist hotspots, with the faint scent of coffee drifting from nearby street vendors and the distant rumble of red double-decker buses navigating the morning traffic. Outside Buckingham Palace, the usual crowd had gathered in waves. Tourists everywhere, kids pointing and giggling. Everyone trying to get that perfect shot before the changing of the guard began. Tour buses disgorged another load of visitors every few minutes, adding to the constant flow of humanity pressing against the ceremonial barriers. Japanese tourists with expensive cameras, American families in matching t-shirts, European backpackers consulting worn guidebooks. The whole world seemed to converge on this single stretch of pavement. You know how it is, parents chasing after children who've wandered too close to the barriers, teenagers taking endless selfies with the guards in the background, tour guides speaking in 5 different languages all at once, their voices creating a low babble of excitement. Street performers worked the edges of the crowd, accordion music mixing with the click of cameras and the shuffle of hundreds of feet on stone. Vendors sold postcards and miniature Union Jack flags from wheeled carts, their calls adding to the cheerful chaos. The morning had that particular energy that comes with perfect weather and holiday anticipation. Families pointed excitedly at architectural details. Couples posed for romantic photos. Children pressed their faces against the ornate gates with wonder. It was the kind of scene that made London look exactly like the movies, grand, historic, and completely safe. Just another ordinary day in one of the busiest spots in London, the kind of day where nothing seems particularly dangerous because everything feels so normal, so controlled, so safe. The kind of day when people let their guard down because surely nothing bad could happen in such a public, well-monitored place. Lance Corporal Miles Doran stood at his post, watching it all unfold with eyes that had learned to see trouble long before it announced itself. 34 years old, broad shoulders filling out his crimson tunic perfectly. A former Royal Marines commando who'd traded desert boots for ceremonial dress but never lost that edge that comes from real combat experience. 2 tours in Helmand Province had taught him to read people the way most folks read newspapers, quickly, thoroughly, and with an eye for the details that mattered most. He'd learned his lessons in places where getting it wrong meant coming home in a flag-draped box, where the difference between a farmer and a suicide bomber sometimes came down to the way someone held their shoulders or the direction their eyes moved when they thought no one was watching, where survival meant cataloging everything: the nervous twitch of a hand near a pocket, the wrong kind of bulge under someone's clothes, the way innocent people moved versus the way predators positioned themselves. Those skills didn't switch off just because he'd traded Afghan mountains for London. Tourists, if anything, they'd sharpened. Because while the stakes might seem lower here, the principles remained the same. Watch everything, trust your instincts, and be ready to act when others were still trying to figure out what was happening. His bearskin hat cast a shadow over eyes that missed nothing, even when they seemed to be staring straight ahead at nothing at all. Those eyes had spotted IEDs buried in Afghan roadsides, tracked insurgents through crowded bazaars, and identified threats in situations where a split-second hesitation meant the difference between going home and going home in a box. To the tourists, he was just part of the scenery, another red-coated figure standing perfectly still, rifle at his side, looking like something out of a postcard or a history book. They had no idea they were looking at a man who could field strip his weapon blindfolded or neutralized. A threat at 300 meters in a crosswind. They saw ceremony. He provided security, but Doran's mind was constantly working, cataloging faces, movements, anything that didn't belong in the rhythm of a normal day. It was a habit that had kept him alive overseas, and old habits died hard, especially the useful ones. That's how he spotted the man in the denim jacket. Most people at the palace gates are there for the same reasons: photos, memories, checking something off their tourist list. They move with purpose, even if that purpose is just wandering around gawking. They cluster in family groups. They chat with strangers about the ceremony. They shift their weight from foot to foot while waiting for something to happen. But this guy was different. He stood still in a crowd full of motion, hands buried deep in his pockets despite the warmth of the day. No camera, no phone, no guidebook, no companion to share the experience with. Just watching. And not in the way tourists watch. There was something predatory about his stillness. Like a cat studying a mouse hole. Doran didn't turn his head, didn't shift his gaze, didn't give any outward sign that he'd noticed anything unusual, but his peripheral vision tracked the man as he slowly worked his way closer to the barrier, moving with the deliberate patience of someone executing a plan rather than someone caught up in the moment. The man was maybe 40, thin but wiry, with the kind of lean strength that comes from manual work or hard living. His clothes were clean but unremarkable, the kind of outfit designed to blend in rather than stand out. His hair was slightly unkempt, like he'd run his fingers through it more than once, and his eyes never stopped moving even when his body remained still. There was something deliberate about his movement, like he was positioning himself rather than just finding a good view, and every few seconds, his right hand would twitch toward his pocket, then stop, as if he was checking to make sure something was still there. Among the crowd, a little girl tugged on her father's jacket sleeve with the persistence that only children possess. "Dad, can I get closer? I want to see the guard's boots up close," she said, bouncing slightly on her toes with excitement. "Please, I promise I'll stay behind the rope." Sophie was 9 years old, with a lopsided ponytail that suggested a hurried breakfast, and school shoes that had seen better days. She wore a bright yellow jacket that made her easy to spot in the crowd, and she had that infectious enthusiasm kids get around anything they find magical. This was clearly the highlight of her London trip, maybe her whole year. Her father was having one of those modern parenting moments, caught between wanting to supervise his daughter and dealing with whatever crisis was unfolding on his phone screen. His thumb moved in steady swipes, his expression growing more frustrated with each message he read. "Work stuff," he muttered to his wife, who was busy taking photos of the palace facade. "Crisis at the office. Give me just 2 minutes to sort this out. Stay behind the rope, all right," he said absently to Sophie, not really looking up. "And don't wander off. I mean it." Sophie grinned and pressed herself against the barrier, close enough to count the buttons on Doran's tunic if she wanted to. Her eyes were wide with wonder, taking in every detail of the uniform, the rifle, the perfect stillness that seemed almost supernatural to a child. She whispered comments to herself about the shiny buckles and the height of the hat, completely absorbed in her own little world of discovery. Doran noticed her immediately, not because she was breaking any rules, but because of where she was standing, right at the edge of the crowd, separated from her father by just enough space to matter. In his peripheral vision, he could see both the excited little girl and the man in the denim jacket who had somehow ended up just a few feet away from her. It wasn't coincidence. Doran had watched the man work his way through the crowd with too much purpose for it to be random. He'd positioned himself near the family groups, near the children who were most likely to stray from their parents' direct supervision, and now he was close enough to Sophie that he could reach out and touch her if he wanted to. The man still hadn't taken out a phone, still hadn't smiled or pointed or done any of the things people do when they're tourists enjoying a moment. His breathing was different too, slower, more controlled, like someone trying to manage their nerves before doing something that required steady hands. His right hand moved behind his back for just a moment, then returned to his pocket. To most people it would have looked like nothing, maybe adjusting his belt, maybe scratching an itch, maybe just the unconscious fidgeting that people do when they're standing around waiting. But Doran had spent 2 tours in Afghanistan learning to read the subtle signs that came just before everything went wrong. The way a man's shoulders tensed before he reached for a weapon, the slight shift in stance that meant someone was about to run or fight, the almost imperceptible change in breathing that happened when adrenaline started flowing, and that movement, that brief, deliberate gestures set off every alarm bell his training had installed in his head. From the sentry box, his partner's voice crackled quietly through the hidden radio mic. "Movement on left flank. Pacing male. Something's off." Doran shifted his weight slightly 2 inches back, anchoring himself. To anyone watching, he still looked perfectly motionless, but his body was now ready to move in a heartbeat if it needed to. The man in the denim jacket took another step closer to the rope. Now he was close enough to reach out and touch Sophie if he wanted to. Her father was still absorbed in his phone, oblivious to everything except whatever was happening on his screen. The man's hand went to his pocket again. This time it stayed there, fingers working at something inside. His eyes were no longer scanning the crowd randomly. They were fixed, focused, calculating. Sophie leaned forward against the barrier, completely captivated by the ceremony she was watching. "Dad, look at his rifle. Is that real?" she called over her shoulder. Father glanced up, briefly smiled and looked back down at his phone. "I'm sure it is, sweetheart." That moment of inattention was all it took. The man's hand came out of his pocket in one smooth motion, and suddenly there was something metal glinting in the morning sun. Not a phone, not keys, not any of the harmless objects people usually pull from their pockets. A blade, thin and sharp, held low and close to his body where most people wouldn't notice it. But Doran noticed everything. The knife was already moving, the man's arm arcing toward the little girl who was still pressed against the barrier, still completely unaware of the danger closing in on her. She was humming something under her breath, probably a song from school, completely lost in her own world of wonder and discovery. The attack was planned, practiced, efficient. No wild swinging, no hesitation, no second thoughts. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of madness. This was someone who had done this before, or at least thought about it enough times to move with terrifying confidence. Sophie was close enough that the man didn't need to lunge. Didn't. need to vault the barrier or make any dramatic movements that might attract attention. Just one quick controlled motion and the blade would find its target before anyone even realized what was happening in that split second. Doran's mind processed a dozen different factors: distance to target, angle of attack, civilians in the potential line of fire, response time for backup, the physics of stopping a knife without endangering bystanders. Two tours in hostile territory had taught him that thinking took too long when lives were on the line. Sometimes you had to trust your training and move before your brain finished calculating all the variables. That's when Lance Corporal Miles Doran did something no ceremonial guard is supposed to do. He moved not dramatically, not with a shout or a battle cry, just a smooth, practiced motion as his rifle came down from its ceremonial position to rest across his chest, the barrel now pointing directly at the man with the knife. The movement was so fluid, so controlled, that for a split second, nobody else noticed. The crowd kept chatting, phones kept clicking, tour guides kept talking, but the man with the knife froze mid-strike, his weapon suspended in the air just inches from Sophie's back. The tableau lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. A little girl humming to herself, completely unaware of the blade hovering behind her. A would-be attacker frozen between intention and action. A soldier who had broken 17 years of ceremonial protocol without a moment's hesitation. Attention settled on him like a net. Phones were starting to come up. People were stepping back, creating a widening circle of space around the confrontation. From across the courtyard, 2 Royal Military Police officers had spotted the disturbance and were working their way through the crowd. Their expressions focused but not panicked. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd trained for exactly this kind of situation. But they weren't there yet. For now, it was just Doran, the little girl, and a man with a knife who was rapidly running out of options. Doran took one careful step forward, his rifle never wavering. The message was crystal clear without him having to say another word. Any closer to the girl and this ends badly for you. Sophie's father finally looked up from his phone, drawn by the sudden hush that had fallen over part of the crowd. When he saw his daughter standing frozen next to a man with a knife with a ceremonial guard's rifle trained on both of them, his face went white as paper. He started to move toward them, but Doran's voice stopped him cold. "Stay where you are." 2 words, spoken quietly but with absolute authority. The father froze, every instinct screaming at him to grab his daughter, but understanding somehow that the soldier knew what he was doing. The man with the knife was trapped now, caught between a rifle he couldn't outrun and a crowd that was no longer oblivious to his presence. His hand shook harder, the blade catching the morning light as it trembled. For a moment that felt like an hour, nobody moved. The entire scene balanced on a knife's edge, waiting to see which way it would fall. Then the man made his choice. Instead of advancing on Sophie, instead of trying to fight, he broke and ran. The knife clattered to the pavement as he spun around and bolted toward the street, shoving through the crowd like a man fleeing demons. Tourists scattered, someone screamed, and suddenly, the peaceful morning erupted into chaos. But not for long. One of the Royal Military Police officers had anticipated the move and was already in position. As the man reached the outer edge of the crowd, the officer stepped into his path and brought him down with a perfectly executed tackle. They hit the pavement hard. The attacker's arms pinned behind his back before he even stopped rolling. It was over in seconds, but the aftermath stretched out like a slow-motion replay. Doran slowly returned his rifle to its ceremonial position, the barrel pointing skyward once again. His breathing was steady, his stance perfect, as if nothing had happened at all, but his heart was still hammering against his ribs, and there was a fine tremor in his hands that only he could feel. Sophie ran to her father, who scooped her up in his arms. Around them, the normal sounds of tourism continued: cameras clicking, children laughing, guides explaining the history of the palace. None of them realized they were witnessing something that would make headlines around the world within hours. Doran hadn't said a word, hadn't called for backup or shouted a warning. He'd simply made it clear that if the blade moved 1 inch closer to that little girl, there would be consequences, the kind of consequences that ended conversations permanently. Silence stretched between them like a held breath. It was the kind of silence that soldiers knew well, the moment before everything either resolved peacefully or exploded into violence. The moment when training took over and time seemed to slow down, until every heartbeat felt like an hour. Sophie was still facing away, still admiring the ceremony, still completely unaware of how close she'd come to something unspeakable. Her father was still looking at his phone, though something in the changed atmosphere was beginning to penetrate his distraction. A few people nearby had noticed that something was wrong, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. But the man with the knife was very much aware of the rifle now pointing at him, and the absolutely motionless soldier holding it. There was something in Doran's stance that communicated more clearly than words ever could. "This ends now, one way or another." Doran's voice, when it finally came, was quiet enough that only the attacker could hear it. "Step back from the child. You have one chance." Not a shout, not a threat, just a statement of fact, delivered in the same tone you might use to give someone directions. The man's hand trembled slightly, the knife wavering in his grip. His eyes darted around, looking for escape routes, for backup, for anything that might help him out of the situation he'd suddenly found himself in. That's when other people started to notice. A woman near the barrier saw the knife first and gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Then another tourist spotted Doran's rifle, no longer at rest but held in ready position. Whispers started rippling through the crowd, like stones dropped in still water. Sophie finally sensed something was wrong and began to turn around. As she did, she came face to face with the man holding the knife, and her eyes went wide with the kind of fear that cuts straight through a child's natural trust in the world. She didn't scream, though. Something about Doran's calm presence, his controlled stance, told her that, despite the knife, despite the man's wild eyes, she was protected. The attacker's breathing was getting shallow now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He held her so tightly she squeaked in protest. His face was white as paper, and his hands shook as he smoothed her hair and whispered reassurances that were as much for himself as for her. The crowd began to settle, but slowly like birds after a gunshot. People kept glancing nervously at the spot where the knife had fallen, now marked with police tape. Some were already uploading videos to social media, their voices breathless with excitement as they narrated what they'd witnessed. "Did you see that?" The guard he didn't even hesitate. 1 second the guy had a knife, the next second he was on the ground. "Is that what they're trained for? I thought they were just for show. That little girl has no idea how lucky she is." Others in the crowd were having different reactions. A woman near the back was crying quietly, probably thinking about her own children. An elderly man stood perfectly still, staring at the spot where the confrontation had happened, his face grave with the weight of what could have been a plain security officer appeared at Doran's side, speaking quietly. "Textbook response, Lance Corporal, we'll take it from here." Doran nodded once but didn't reply. His job was done. The girl was safe. The threat was neutralized. Order was restored. Everything else was someone else's responsibility. That's how the system worked, and the system had worked exactly as it was supposed to. As the attacker was loaded into a police van and the crowd slowly returned to normal, Sophie's father approached the barrier one more time. He looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes, the weight of what had almost happened written clearly on his face. His hands were still shaking, and there was a tremor in his voice when he spoke. Behind him, police officers were cordoning off the area where the knife had fallen, treating it as a crime scene. Detectives in plain clothes were already interviewing witnesses, taking statements from the tourists who had been close enough to see what happened. The atmosphere had shifted from holiday excitement to something more serious. "More sobering, sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to control. Doran's eyes didn't move from their forward position, but he was listening. In his peripheral vision, he could see the man's struggle, the guilt of a father who had failed to protect his child, the gratitude toward a stranger who had stepped in when it mattered most, the overwhelming realization of how close they'd all come to tragedy. "I don't know how to thank you. I was right there, and I didn't even see." His voice trailed off, breaking slightly on the last word. "She could have been if you hadn't." He couldn't finish the sentence. Some thoughts were too terrible to speak aloud. It hung in the air between them. This wasn't just about one act of heroism, it was about the failure of systems, the randomness of violence, and how quickly a normal day could unravel into a parent's worst nightmare. "She's safe," Doran said, his voice calm, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had seen enough of the world to know what truly matters. "That's what matters." The man nodded, eyes misty, and gently led his daughter away as they walked. Sophie glanced back one last time at the guard who had protected her, not with flair or bravado, but by simply being where he was needed, at the exact moment it counted. She didn't wave or smile. The morning had been too intense for that, but there was something in her eyes, a depth of understanding far beyond her years, that showed she knew she'd been saved by more than just luck. The morning routine resumed. Tourists resumed their sightseeing, the ceremonial change continued, as scheduled, and life at Buckingham Palace returned to its rhythm. But something had shifted, something unspoken, even if no one could quite explain it. When the shift change came at midday, Doran stepped down from his post with the same discipline and precision he'd maintained all morning. Inside the barracks, another guard looked up from cleaning his rifle. "Everything all right out there?" Heard there was some excitement. Doran hung up his ceremonial tunic and reached for his regular uniform. "Nothing that couldn't be handled," he said. He didn't explain further. There was no need to replay it, no reason to turn it into a story. A child had been in danger, and now she wasn't. That was the beginning and end of what truly mattered. Later that afternoon, a small bouquet of flowers appeared by the palace gates. No card, no note. Just white roses tied with a simple ribbon, placed exactly where Sophie had stood. Passing tourists took pictures, probably assuming it was some kind of official tribute or memorial. In a way, they weren't wrong. The next morning, a familiar family returned to the palace gates. Sophie wore a new blue dress and held her father's hand tightly as they joined the crowd once more to watch the ceremony. Her eyes scanned the line of guards, searching for a face she would never forget. When she didn't find him, A flicker of disappointment crossed her expression, but she stood a little taller, watching the guards with a new sense of reverence. She understood now. Beneath the show, beneath the uniforms and tradition, were real soldiers doing a real job. Her father had spent most of the night trying to explain to family and friends what had happened, how close they'd come to losing what mattered most. But the words had never seemed enough. How do you explain the moment when a stranger steps between your child and unthinkable danger? How do you measure that? How do you explain the value of someone who sees what others overlook? Sophie didn't need an explanation. She understood perhaps more clearly than many adults that real protection often comes from those who ask for nothing in return. That real strength isn't loud or boastful. It doesn't announce itself. It simply waits in the background, quiet and ready, until the moment it's needed. And when that moment comes, it acts not for recognition, not for medals or applause, but because it's the right thing to do. The ceremony continued around them. Red tunics moved in flawless formation, bearskin hats swayed in rhythm, and polished rifles caught the sunlight. To most tourists, it was a display, a spectacle, another perfect picture to capture, another checkbox on their London itinerary. But for those who were paying attention, for those who now saw it through a different lens, it was more than that. It was a promise, a quiet, steadfast commitment that somewhere in this world, people still believe in duty over glory, service over self, and in doing the right thing simply because it's right. And in a world that often feels chaotic, where noise drowns out meaning and spectacle overshadows truth, that kind of quiet courage is worth more than all the pageantry in the world. Have you ever stopped to think what it truly takes to protect someone? Is it about power, volume, aggression, or is it about calm in the face of fear? Readiness without recklessness, courage without ego. If this story showed you what real strength looks like, if it reminded you that heroes don't always carry titles or shout their intentions, then hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories that honor those who serve silently. SELFLESSLY. And share this with someone who might need a reminder. The strongest protectors are often the quietest. You'll find more true Royal Guard stories on your screen now. We post new ones every day, showing the human side of these remarkable soldiers. See you tomorrow. Same time, same place.